Cultural diffusion and modern Korean culture. Post-1945 to the late 1980s.
In this next section, where we examine the different cultural influences during the post-liberation period, we'll see that there is a multitude of influences and how this affected the development of South Korean culture.
What role do you think political ideology played in shaping of Korean culture?
Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule on August 15th, 1945. And as Soviet troops began to occupy the northern part of the peninsula and American troops in the southern part of the peninsula, there was a separation and division of Korea. Separate states were formally established in 1948 with the elections and then the establishment of the Republic of Korea with Syngman Rhee as its first president in the South, and with the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and Kim Il-sung elected as its first premier in the North. So what develops after this is very specific communist and social influences in the northern part and democratic capitalist influences in the southern part of the peninsula. And with the Cold War and Cold War ideology, these differences became increasingly stark as we go through the 1950s, the 1960s, and into the 1970s. For South Korea, there was a pivot from Japanese influence to American influence in culture. So as there were approximately 40,000 US troops stationed in the southern part of the peninsula, and they established bases throughout the country and camp towns. There was quite a bit of not only a physical presence of the US military, but also they brought with them their culture, their food, their language, their entertainment, all aspects of American culture infiltrated into Korea. So what we see here is a picture of a US Army base here on the top, the largest one being in Yongsan, and a hamburger place that was opened up in Yongsan. So obviously hamburgers are not native to Korean culture, and it is not part of traditional Korean cuisine, but this was introduced as Americans established a military presence in the southern part of Korea. The picture that we see here on the bottom left is the first McDonald's that was opened in Apgujeong, south of the river, in 1988. And so as a result of this, we see a proliferation of not only fast food, including McDonald's and Burger King and Pizza Hut and Kentucky Fried Chicken, but Koreans have now adapted to this type of food and they have created their own version of it. There is Lotteria, which is like a fast food chain that also sells burgers, but they are very much Koreanized. So they implement Korean ingredients and Korean flavors. So this is an example of cultural diffusion. And then more recently, we see how there are specialty type of hamburger joints within Korea. And these are more gourmet style, but they also include and incorporate Korean ingredients and Korean flavors. Now, beginning in the 1950s, after the Korean War ended, the South Koreans were focused on reconstruction. So it was about rebuilding South Korea, since especially many parts of Seoul had been destroyed. And so this is a picture that we see here of what is currently Sejong-hall and would become a big art center right in the middle of downtown Seoul. And this is largely a part of the overall reconstruction program that occurred during the Syngman Rhee presidencies. As we go into the 1960s, we see that the reconstruction program was quite successful and that Seoul is quite urbanized. So this is a picture again of downtown Seoul in the 1960s with a view of Gwanghwamun, or the main thoroughfare that leads from the southern part, or Namdaemun, all the way up to where the royal palace is. And the palace is obstructed by the government general building, the main colonial administrative building, because the colonial administrative building was still being used by the South Korean government. But you can see that the roads have been widened, they are paved, there are modern style buildings, and this is just evidence of the increasing urbanization that occurred throughout the 1960s. As we get into the 1970s, there is still further urbanization, and because during the Park Chung-hee regime, Park Chung-hee pushed for rapid industrialization and economic development, that this also contributed to the development and urbanization of the capital in Seoul. This is a picture of Jongno, or one of the main thoroughfares in downtown Seoul, and Nagwon Arcade, which is now known for selling all kinds of musical instruments. But if you look down in the corner there, you can see that there is English writing and a store that sells tires. So again, it is this influence from the United States, where we have not only increasing economic development through capitalist ventures, but we also see the English writing that is being incorporated into not only the signage, but the spoken language, and that this starts to seep into the overall Korean culture. Now, this area in Jongno, it acted as one of the main shopping districts throughout the 60s and the 70s. And as the Korean economy developed and the Korean average income increased, they had more spending money, they were consuming more, and so not only do we see economic development, urbanization, but there's also an increase in consumerism throughout the 60s and the 70s. And then this would lend itself into Koreans now buying up the products that South Korea was starting to produce. So whether it was Hyundai cars, or whether it was Samsung Electronics, or these other initial products that Korean conglomerates were starting to produce. They weren't exporting as much as we see them doing today, but this is what Koreans were starting to really consume in larger and larger numbers, and that they could afford to consume. So this increasing consumerism, we see, for example, these are some sample products, initial products of Gold Star, a radio and a television set. And Gold Star is would go on to become the very, very large conglomerate that we all know now as LG. And LG is now a globally recognized brand. They are known for producing some of the highest quality electronics, but these were some of their humble products at the beginning. And many Korean households, they were stocked with these kinds of Korean products because imported products were exorbitantly too expensive, and so Koreans initially were consuming their locally produced products. This is what we call protectionism. So this was what Park Chung-hee, the former president, focused on, the domestic economic development and to protect the domestic economy. So the government then supporting the local conglomerates and giving them tax breaks and whatever kind of financial incentives, and then also making it more difficult to import foreign goods because it was too expensive. This is a depiction of celebration of Korea reaching its $10 billion export mark in 1977. We also see here the establishment of the Korean Broadcasting System, or KBS, which is one of the original television channels in Korea. This was in 1973. So as we see economic development and the increasing democratization of South Korea, there was also a shift from state media to public broadcasting, although public broadcasting still was heavily influenced by the authoritarian government. Things really started to change around the time of the 1988 Olympics that were held in Seoul. So after winning their bid to host the Olympics in Seoul, the South Korean government, they mobilized all kinds of resources to start building stadiums and other infrastructure in order to host and to prepare for the international community and the visitors who would be coming to Seoul in order to participate in the Olympics. This is a picture of Jamsil Stadium, which was one of the main venues for the Olympics, and then there were also other Olympic sites that were established, including a very large park and a large housing complex. This all occurred in the southern part of Seoul, or more specifically, south of the Han River and in the southeastern area. Now, the southeastern area of Seoul was rather undeveloped up until this time, but because the South Korean government wanted to develop this part of the city, many old buildings were destroyed, and even some ancient artifacts. So Baekje tombs, that was a site for many of the Baekje tombs, and according to Japanese colonial records, over 300 of these tombs originally existed there, but after the development in preparation for the Seoul Olympics, something like only over 20 of them still exist today. This was also the beginnings of what would later on go on to become the Korean Wave, and the development of Korean culture, which would take elements from Western films, particularly from Hollywood, or American television, or American pop music, and develop it so that it became its own and would develop into what would become then Hallyu.
These are the keywords for this class: liberation, democracy, economic development,